Alrighty, thanks everyone for joining with us today. Today we'll be covering preparing for entry into the lamb feedlot. So, firstly, animal health, the must-dos, and answering some should-Is. Secondly, imprinting lambs and getting a head start. Thirdly, infrastructure, setting up for a successful program. And then finally, induction, the extra effort early will reap rewards. All right, the animal health, the must-dos. Vaccination and drenching. Why are these must-dos and what is the importance of them? We'll head over to Nicole now for some insight into this.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, there are really a couple of must-dos before these lambs come into the feedlot, and you've probably heard of these before, but I'll just touch on why they're important. And the first one is if you're bringing your own lambs into the feedlot, please ensure that they've had their booster vaccination. You can see there the graph on the right. The immune response to that second booster vaccination is what really kicks it into gear and makes it work. One of the most easily preventable deaths in the feedlot is pulpy kidney, so we really want to protect against that just for the sake of that extra dose of vaccine. If you've got lambs coming in and you don't know the history, it is ideal if you can treat them as they've never been vaccinated, so giving them 2 doses. At a bare minimum 1, it would be helpful, but 2 obviously ideal if you don't know their history. And just the other thing to be aware of is that some of the vaccines only cover pulpy kidney for around 3 months. So if your booster vaccination was longer than 3 months ago, it's an ideal time to give another one coming into the feedlot as well. So just keep that in mind. There is a couple of different types of booster vaccinations or Clostridial 61 vaccinations I'm talking about here that you can need to give. Now, in regards to drenching, depending where these lambs are coming from, all stock arriving to your farm that hasn't been there before, I would give a quarantine drench, most definitely. If you've got your own lambs, you can do a worm egg count. And I know in the Riverina here this year, we've tested our own lambs at home and they've actually been really, really low, which is surprising, but we've had some multiple rain events and going to keep an eye on those. And the best way to do that is do a worm egg count every 30 days. So you may be able to save yourself a few dollars on drench there if you've got some low egg counts, but please keep that in mind and you must do a worm egg count to check where they're at. And if you're using your own lambs at home, don't forget to rotate your drench class to a different class of active there to what you've already been using on your farm as well, and that will give you the most cost-effective way to clean out those lambs as they go into the feedlot. So normally those 2 procedures are done together, and ideally a vaccination is done 14 days before changing onto a different feed type. So keep that in mind. It's often too hard to do that. Bring them in and then, tip them out for 14 days and bring them back in again. So if you've got a good slow induction onto grain, that 14 days sort of is within that 14-day time frame of letting that vaccine kick in. So just keep that in mind as well. So don't just go and tip some grain in them quickly and hope they're all right. There's other reasons we'll get into about that as well. But yeah, it does take 14 days for that second vaccine to kick in. Back to you, Jess.
All right, now we'll head into animal health, the should-Is. So a common question we receive in regards to booster vaccinations is whether they should pick an option with the B12. Nicole, should we be vaccinating with the B12 option?
Yeah, another good question we quite often get, and it's primarily driven through price, given the vaccine with B12 is roughly twice the price. So B12 is used for energy production in the lamb, along with a host of other B vitamins. So my sort of rule of thumb is if I've got lambs coming in from another area and they've been mustered and yarded and transported, I give them a B12 would be useful just to pick them up, get them going again, get them eating, possibly reduce that time delay onto feed. And basically useful for sort of stressed lambs. If you've got your own lambs coming in, I don't actually worry about a B12 anymore. B12, all the B vitamins are created by the rumen microbes, and B12 requires cobalt to do that. So We use cobalt and B12 in our vitamin buff pellets to help that, and so that if we've got a healthy rumen, those microbes are able to use that cobalt and make their own B12 and get going. So you can save yourself a few dollars there in that scenario.
Alrighty. So we've also got AD&E, vitamin AD&E, and recently, Nicole, I was visiting a V&B client of ours on farm, and they mentioned that they actually didn't see the benefits of vaccinating for AD&E. Why might this have been the case?
Yeah, AD&E, it's another good one that we often get questions about, and vitamin A and E particularly are found in green feed. So if those lambs have had access to some green feed before entry into the feedlot, they sort of will have a store of that in their liver. That lasts for around 3 months. So it's not until we sort of have those drought conditions like we've had over the last couple of years where they haven't seen green feed at all. That's when vitamin A, D and E is really useful. So A and E in particular will help the immune system, and vitamin D will help calcium absorption as well. So A is also involved with eye membrane health. So if you're sort of prone to a bit of pink eye and really dusty conditions and irritants, that can be of use. Particularly if you've come off green feed, going into the feedlot, you don't really require that A, D and E. And again, we put vitamin A, D and E in our vitamin buff concentrate as well to support their immune system.
Awesome, that's a great answer. So we've also got bovilis. So commonly in the beef feedlotting industry, respiratory disease or bovine respiratory disease is a major issue in feedlot cattle. So similarly, should we be vaccinating our lambs as well against this?
Yeah, so Cooper's done a whole lot of great research on bovilis use in sheep. So there is now a claim that it's safe for use in sheep. They're still working on getting their claim for use, particularly in the lamb feedlot. But I'll let you talk to your Cooper's rep about that. But essentially, the respiratory disease that we see in lambs commonly is pneumonia, and quite often last season was a really bad season for it with the smoke in the air and all the dust. It causes an irritant on the lungs, and bacteria invade and cause pneumonia. So we can say now that it's safe for use in sheep, but I urge you to, if you've got pneumonia issues, to talk to your local Cooper's rep about that one. But hopefully moving forward, we'll be able to help protect them against pneumonia too.
Alrighty, animal health covered. Let's move on to imprinting lambs. Imprinting or familiarising your lambs onto feed. Nicole, what is the importance of imprinting, and which feed sources is this particularly relevant for?
Yeah, so we typically find that they're not too bad picking up barley if they've never seen grain before, and it's probably most likely going to be a season like the one we've had where ewes haven't been, trail fed or had a self-feeder in front of them through the drought, and the lambs haven't learnt to eat off their mothers. So cereal grain's pretty good. They're not too bad coming onto that. It's the ingredients more like lupins. They're little hard ball bearings that you quite often speak to people about, and they've either spat them out or pushed them to the side of the feed trough, and they take quite a long time to sort of get onto them. And when they're quite an expensive part of the ration, so you want to make sure that they're getting into them. I find that cracking the lupins helps a lot. It seems to open up, it's not a digestion thing, or at least a little bit, but it's primarily to get them the smell and the taste. I think it just helps them come onto those lupins a lot quicker. And obviously then they're able to utilise that a little bit better as well. You don't see the whole lupins passing through in the manure nearly as much. And so you're getting more bang for your buck that way as well. Now, it does require, obviously, a roller meal or a way to be able to crack those lupins. Fortunately, our Colliambly meal now is set up as a blend plant, and we're able to crack lupins there if that's an option for you. We were able to do, a crack lupin and V&B blend if that suits. But certainly cracking lupins will help them come onto lupins, and it's really important if you can, during the what we call the imprinting phase, or before they come into the feedlot, where they were trail fed for a few to 3 or 4 times, just so they learn to eat that grain. Ideally, if you use the same ingredients that are in your feedlot ration, so lupins, for example, so they can start to get used to them, that will certainly shorten the time that takes for them to come on feed into in the feedlot. And if we can slightly reduce the stress along the way, that certainly helps, because stress is cumulative. So if they're going to a new environment, new pen mates, new infrastructure, which we'll talk about in a minute, you know, we can try and reduce the stress, that at least they know what their feed source is and they can get onto that a lot quicker. The other one there I've got a picture of is the concentrate pellet. So if you're going to add obviously a grain balancer to it, ideally you would have that fed out trail feeding and getting them to learn what it is initially as well. Any new feed source, like as we said with lupins, or a pellet that's of a different structure and shape and texture, they can take a couple of days to sort of get used to that. May even be up to a week, the shyer ones as well. So just keep that in mind. And as I said, if we can get them imprinted and trail fed before they go into the feedlot to familiarise themselves, will certainly pay off this season where they possibly haven't seen any grain yet, just with the flush of feed around.
Alrighty. So now we move into infrastructure. So we've discussed imprinting on feed, but imprinting on infrastructure is also important. Particularly this season, with a lot of feed on offer, lambs may have never seen a feeder before. Nicole, can you discuss with us how to imprint our lambs onto infrastructure?
Yeah, yep, it's a big one for this season. They probably haven't seen a feed cart or a self feeder or any of that, which is fantastic. But yeah, there's obviously a whole different range of feeding systems, and you know, quite often you could have different types of feeders within the same pen. For example, you might have bunks, you might have obviously the self feeders are pretty popular as well. But once you've trail fed them and then you bring them into the feedlot, just putting some of the feed in the tray just to allow them to access to that. You know, you can just bucket that in for a little bit if you're able to. It just encourages them to go to the feeder. There's some smell there for them to come onto, instead of just filling it up and having the slides there. So that'll encourage them and just shorten that time down a little bit. You only really need to do it for a couple of days so they can get going onto it. And the other one there that we sometimes forget about too is water. So particularly lambs that have been out in paddocks with dams, they've got to come in, figure out what a water trough is. You might have all different types of water troughs. There's one there, you know, it's quite different again, you know, the PVC ones, or even your concrete troughs. Just be aware that they may not have never seen them before. And alternatively, another one we get is if they've come off dam water and they come into a feedlot on pipeline water or bore water, a different form of water, they can take a little while to adapt to that. So if those lambs don't drink, they don't eat. So if possible, adapting them to the new type of water and exposure to new water infrastructure will certainly help them get up and going in the feedlot really quickly as well. And just touching on water, it is super important, and try to have, you know, at least 2 or 3 days water supply up your sleeve, just in case something happens as well. So that's just another one as we move into summer, to make sure they have that on hand, and that they'll roughly drink about 4 to 6 litres a day per head, to give you some numbers there as well.
Yeah, that's great. So, Nicole, we've just discussed why it's important, but I think it's also really important to discuss what the implications would be if you were unable to imprint your lambs on feed and infrastructure coming into the feedlot.
Yeah, it essentially just slows down that time coming onto feed. And when you do your feed budgets, one of the big things is that affects your profitability is the days on feed. So if we can sort of try and shorten up those days on feed, even if it's 3, 4, 5, 6 days a week, if we can shorten up that time, when they're in the feedlot, they just adapt straight away, or adapt a lot quicker to those feeders, the water source, and they can get growing and putting their energy into growth. They're not getting there's not an extra stress there that they have to learn what to eat and drink from as well. So if you can possibly do it, it'll certainly pay off later on and decrease time on feed and save you some more money as well.
Great. All right. So we've talked about imprinting, but is there any other jobs we need to think about before bringing our lambs into the feedlot? Yeah,
so it's just another little one on infrastructure really is just really a tidy up, and it's a couple of little tips and tricks here that we've got. And I'm hoping you'll all be over cleaning out your water troughs and making sure that they don't look like the one on the slide. We want them nice and clean and fresh for them to come in. As I said, if they don't drink, they won't eat. So we want to make sure that that we've got a nice fresh water source for them. Now, you don't necessarily need, really long water troughs in the feedlot. For a pen size of, we roughly have about 200 to 300 head in a pen, which is, ideal. You're allowed about 2.5 centimetres a head, which is, a sort of 6 to 8 foot length trough. Just be aware too of the height of your troughs. So making sure that, depending on the type of size of the lambs you get in, making sure that they can actually reach in and drink the water. Like, you might want to reassess if you've got cattle troughs, for example, that it's quite high. Can your lambs get in there and drink? So just be aware of that. And so there's the shorter sheep troughs are obviously a bit more preferred. And, you're not going to waste as much water either when you clean them out through your feeding program. Now, one of the really important things with water in terms of your troughs is actually your water flow, your refill rate. You don't want lambs standing around waiting for a drink if you've got a really slow flow rate, particularly when it's hot. So that's your flow rate's really important, and just to make sure that those troughs refill quickly for those lambs. They sort of tend to move in different parts of the pen throughout the day, so they'll a few of them will come in for a drink, and we want to make sure that flow rate's really good to refill. In terms of your cell feeders, just a couple of little tips. Give them a clean out before you reuse them again. Just get rid of any mouldy, stale feed with a broom there. And in terms of feeder trough space, your standard sort of cell feeder that's around 2.4 metres long, you want about 80 lambs per feeder. Quite often we don't see enough trough space for the number of lambs in the pen. So you can have more lambs as long as you've got more feeders in there. That's a really critical part, is just that trough space to minimise the shy feeders. In terms of stocking density, 3 to 5 square metres per head is about typical. You can have, I think you can have down to about 1.5 from an animal welfare perspective, but 3 to 5 seems to be about right if you want to work that out with your yards. But yeah, around 200 to 250, maybe 300 a pen, sort of about our maximum we want to see. Again, trough space is the critical one there. And one of the big things I'd like to remind you, because we get a few of these come in, is to remember to reset your slides back down from the previous feedlotting program that you've done. So they're usually quite open at the end of your feedlotting program, or possibly even ad lib. Just remember to bring those slides back down to around 5 mil just to start again. And I do have a picture of shade on there as well. So shade's always another good question that we get. And it doesn't, you can have, this is a metal structure there that's down at Peter Boyd's farm at Kanimbla at Cowra there, or you can use shade cloth, or you can fence off some trees so they don't ring bark them. And it's always a big issue, because you tend to find that sheep will find their own shade and they stick their heads all together. However, as soon as you have shade available, they're all under it. You've just got to make sure you've got enough space and airflow. So you don't want them too low. You want the airflow to be moving through. But essentially, especially over summer, as it's reducing their heat stress load. So if we can keep their heat stress load down a little bit, that means that they'll continue to eat. So once lambs get really heat stressed, they'll go off their feed, and they essentially obviously stop growing as well, or stop growing as fast. So consider some shade if you can as well. It'll be of benefit.
Right. Thanks, Nicole. That's a great summary of all the things we need to consider when setting our feedlot up and bringing our lambs into a feedlot. So now that we've covered animal health, imprinting our lambs and preparing our feedlot, we'll move into induction. What are the key considerations for the induction phase?
Yes, really important part of the program as they come in, and we'll get into some more nitty gritty in our next webinar. But just to get you started here, there's really 3 components of feedlotting lambs, and it's genetics, nutrition, and management. So we can cover the nutrition part for you, that's fine, but the management side is super important in that induction phase, and it comes really down to obviously preparing the feedlot as we've just discussed, but also the slide management as they come into the feedlot. So I'm sure nearly everyone's probably opened up those slides a little bit too quickly and had a few lambs get crook. But what we really want to do, and I've given you some guidelines here because we sort of about having the slides down, but how much is that really, what sort of spacings are that? And I've given you some numbers there to sort of work with, and starting at a 5 mil gap for, 4 to 5 days, moving it open to 8, and then again from about 10 to a 10 mil gap, a centimetre, from about day 10 onwards. And some people go ad lib from about 14 days onwards if you choose to, but that gives that time for those rumen microbes to adapt. And what they need to adapt to is the starch levels. So I've just given you an indication there of where the starch levels of our common cereal grains sit at. So oats will sit at about 45% starch, barley 55 to 60, and wheat 60 to 65. So a lot of people will often, blend oats and barley, 50-50 to start with, and it's all about really is the starch level. We know that oats are a lot safer. They've got a lower starch level, primarily due to the husk around them, just a different form, and we can have that blend there. It's quite common, and then as they move through that induction phase of that 10 to 14 days, you can increase the barley content. So through by sort of day 14, they're back onto a barley only diet. So we've actually also created a lamb safe start blend out of our Colliambly mill, which comparatively, is fairly similar to oats there. But still delivering, good energy at 12 megajoules, and it's a little higher on protein as well, just to get those lambs up and going a bit. So that's another option there for you. We've taken some of the risk out of that. Now, the other big one is forage availability. So like most commonly, most of the systems we see are self-feeders with ad lib hay or straw in that pen. Obviously, if you've got a total mixed ration, you can adjust the forage that's in your ration as well. But if with your self-feeder setup, having those lambs having access to hay, palatable hay to start with. So even in that induction phase, if you have a legume-based hay, a vetch rye or a clover rye or even some lucerne, we just want to actually encourage consumption of that forage through that induction phase. And you might have it in there for a week and then start to bring in your cereal or straw hays as well. But we want them to have gut fill before you get that grain into the self-feeder. So let them fill up on hay before you put that grain into the self-feeder, and they have access to that. And in terms of quality from there onwards, it's not necessarily about, that the legume-based legume-based hays as we move forward. It's really about a fresh hay, like a cereal hay or a straw. And I guess, I think given with the drought, there's not too much really bad hay around. It's sort of gone, although we have had some weather damage hay come through this season already just with the rain. But just keep that in mind, that it's just got to be fresh and relatively palatable, because we still want them to consume that forage through that feeding program and balance that out with hay. And another little good tip is to put your hay or straw that you have on offer between the water point and your self-feeder, just to encourage them to stop and have a chew on that forage. If you have that further away, you'll get some lambs that will literally just stand at a feeder, drink, and come back to the self-feeder. So just encouraging them by putting that hay or straw in between the watering point and the self-feeder will help them have some of that forage, which basically helps with rumen turnover and getting the most out of the feed that you're giving them as well. So lower starch levels through induction and slide management is super important, and having that good forage available too is sort of the key to getting induction started.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So, in summary, guys, the key ones were our animal health procedures. Our must-dos were vaccination and drenching. Our should-I's were B12. Its importance was for stressed lambs and trade lambs that have been purchased in, but remember, we do actually have B12 and cobalt in our vitamin buff. Similarly for AD and E, if they've had no exposure to green feed in the last 3 months, it can be useful for very dusty conditions. And then Bovilis, once again, it's now registered in sheep for use in sheep. Imprinting and infrastructure, the importance for that was adaptation onto higher grain rations. So less time on feed will retrieve I guess, better returns. And then induction, our slide management, starch level, and palatable forage.
Okay, so I think we're going to move now if we have any questions. There was one that came through earlier that I'll put out to yourself, Nicole and Jess, just on a little bit more details of the lamb safe start and what that entails. If you could give a little bit more details on that, that was a pre-submitted question that we could kick off with.
Yeah, sure. So lamb safe start's really designed, I guess, to take the risk out of getting your induction sort of ration right. And that's a blended mix. So we do use some barley in there. We've got some lupins, and we also use soybean hulls. So soybean hulls are a really great source of energy, but very, very low on starch. So we're able to keep the energy high at 12 megajoules, but keep the starch levels low in that. And we've also gone with a 17% protein diet there. Now, a typical lamb feedlot is around 16%, and that's really, with your 16% protein feedlot diet, they're really aimed at, your 36, 38 kilo entry weights of lambs coming into the feedlot. So you can use this if your lambs are a little bit lighter, although this season they probably won't be. But the other good benefit of having that little bit of extra protein through induction is really to help with immune response. So there's a lot of stresses coming in from that lamb. Even if you've got your own lambs coming in, they're going to be split up into different pens possibly. Again, we've got the new feeds and infrastructure that hopefully we've exposed them a little bit to coming in. But it will really support their immune system. So immune function is probably a little bit underrated in the feedlot. We try to focus on, not killing them in lots of other ways, but immune function is one of those sort of hidden things that you don't necessarily see. But if we can support that immune system, help them adapt to the stresses that they've got sort of facing them in that first sort of induction phase, it really just helps them out, and they can get over that a little bit quicker and easier and get growing and hopefully shorten up your days on feed as well at the end of it.
Perfect.
Hopefully that's covered what they're after.
Yeah, perfect. And another question that's come in from Steph. So what causes sheep to get sore-footed when on feed, Nicole and Jess?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. So it depends on your setup. So if you're bringing multiple lambs in each year, you can actually bring like hoof infections in unknowingly. Especially if you're using trade lambs, so it can be in your soil. You have a bit of a rain, and that can be an issue. Alternatively, the other one is when they have through that induction phase in particular, if they have a lot of grain coming in, that can cause some endotoxin release in their system as well and affect their hoof structure a little bit as well. So if anyone's got horses, they would see that in the laminitic type horse as well. So, but that's sort of part of it, and lots of protein. So there's really an imbalance of energy and protein, lots of sugars and starches coming in. That can also affect sort of their hooves as well.
Perfect. I think that was our 2 questions. Is anything else coming through? I think that's it so far. But look, if anybody has any questions that they think of after our session, please feel free to email us. Oh, hold on, we've got a couple more. Here we go. Regina, how do you prevent prolapsing in feedlots?
Yeah, so prolapses, really, really common in some places. So again, last year was a really bad year for it with the smoke and the dust. So the coughing caused quite a bit of that when they're coughing with the smoke and the dust and the irritants on their lungs. So tail length's the biggest one. We want to make sure we've got at least 3 palpable joints down when those tails are docked. Not always easy to do when you're buying lambs in and their tails are already been docked a little bit shorter than what we prefer. Another one with prolapses could be that they're possibly getting the start of urinary calculi, where the little stone blocks up the urethra and they're starting to strain. So that can be another cause of prolapses. And we'll get into urinary calculi a little bit more in our next webinar, but they're sort of the main ones there. And there is a little bit of an unknown scenario too. I'll admit that we're sort of still trying to work out why some are worse than others in different areas, but certainly tail length's a big one. Those dusty, irritant, coughing conditions, and the beginnings of possibly urinary calculi, where the stone may not have completely blocked the urethra and caused the bladder to fill, but they're straining as they're trying to get that urine out, and it's starting to partially block the urethra there. So they're sort of the main ones that I see from that, and urinary calculi is due to a few different things there that we'll get into next week as well.
Perfect. Okay, we've got another question from David. How many days on feed should we aim for to take a second cross lamb from 38 kilo average to around that 55 kilo mark?
Yeah, it's usually, if you can aim for at least 300 to 400 grams a day, it will depend on the nutrient density of your ration, obviously. So if you can get lots of good energy and protein, the right protein into them, they'll certainly, steam along at 400 grams a day, which off the top of my head was around 6 to 8 weeks. I'd have to go back and calculate my numbers on that again, but it's usually around that time.
Okay, perfect. All right, as mentioned, if there's any more questions, feel free to contact our team. Thanks everybody for joining our first webinar in the series. We look forward to joining you for our second, where we talk all about the role of feed additives. And we've got a guest speaker, Kate Hearn, that will join us. She's a mycotoxin expert, so it'll be a great session to join, and we hope to see you there. If anybody's missed out on this session, it will be recorded as well. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Nicole and Jess.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.